Hello, my name is Jo. Let's talk about what I read in November and December. So in November, I did not read very much because I was focusing on Spanish and time just kind of got away from me. But the first book that I finished was The Guest by sok-yong. This is one of several of his books that I read over the course of the past few months, and I have really enjoyed reading his books. I do plan to read all of the ones that have been translated. He is a Korean author, and The Guest was kind of a different work from the other ones of his that I have read. It is the story of a massacre that occurred in North Korea during the Korean War, and this has historically been attributed to the US by North Korea. And there are some varying accounts of exactly how this happened. In this book, Hwang adopts a narrative that is told by some survivors of the massacre who state that actually it was Korean nationals from both communist North Korea and Christian capitalist South Korea who carried out this massacre. Obviously, I have no idea which, narrative is correct or if it's some combination that's, way outside of my pay range. I really know very little about Korean history and I'm only just beginning to learn, so, I'm not in any way commenting on the accuracy of this narrative, but it was very interesting to read. He is kind of framing this from the beginning as the story of two kind of alien forces or diseases that infiltrated Korea, and he's using the name The Guest, which was given to smallpox, which was also introduced by foreigners to Korea, to kind of illustrate the spread of both communism and Christianity or capitalism in Korea. I really, really loved this concept, and I kind of, to some extent, wish that he had stuck with it a little bit more because he doesn't really, in my opinion. I kind of forgot that that was even how it was supposed to be framed until I started writing my review. But nonetheless, I still found this a very, very interesting read. It was incredibly sad, obviously, given the subject matter, but it follows a man who is the brother of someone who was involved in the massacre, and he is on kind of his homegoing journey to visit North Korea on a state-sanctioned visit. So you hear from multiple perspectives from both modern times and historical times. I thought this was a really good story. I didn't emotionally connect with it as much as I have some of his other works, but it was still well worth the read. The next book that I finished was El león, la bruja y el ropero, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in Spanish. I was a big Narnia reader as a child. It was kind of my fantasy series, and so it was really interesting to revisit this. This is the first time that I've read it, I believe, as an adult. If I reread it as an adult, it was definitely as like an 18 or 19-year-old. Obviously, reading in Spanish, I didn't quite, fully get the experience since I'm only just learning Spanish, but it was interesting to read because I had either forgotten or didn't notice at the time just how blatantly religious this is. The allegories are affronting you with their allegoryness, which is okay, that was what he set out to do, but it was interesting to reread. So definitely if you have reread Narnia as an adult, particularly maybe if you were religious as a child and are no longer religious, I would be very interested to see what you thought of it. But yeah, still very enjoyable. There was one book in between, but I will just follow that up with El sobrino del mago, which is The Magician's Nephew, which is the prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, written later. But this is, again, just an incredibly blatant allegory for Genesis story. I felt like this was maybe a little bit long. It's not a very long book, so that sounds strange to say, but I did feel like there could have been a little bit more story there, but I just love the concept of the wood between the worlds, so I did enjoy that. I wish that there was more coverage of that. If you've ever seen the show The Magicians or read the books that it's based on by Lev Grossman, I believe, they did a little bit with the wood between the worlds, and I thought that that was very interesting. Another Narnia, you'll be seeing the rest of them at some point whenever I get to them. The book that I read between those two was On the Origin of Species and Other Stories by Kim Bo-young. This is a collection of short stories, obviously translated from Korean, that I picked up at the library randomly, and I loved this collection. As is often the case for me with short stories collections, not every single short story completely wowed me, but multiple did. I particularly What are you doing? But multiple of the short stories did really capture my imagination, and I felt like were very insightful. There was one about the pressure that we put on young people. There was another one about kind of humanity versus animals, the distinctions that we draw that are based on our own intellect and things like that. I read a nonfiction book on this topic called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? That if you are interested in the topic, or if you like pop science books, I would highly recommend that one as well. I highly recommend this short story collection. Next, I listened to the entire Hunger Games series. I was reading it in Spanish, and I just kind of got the urge to listen to them again in English. I don't think that I've reread these since around when they came out, or maybe when the movies came out I might have reread them. So I would have been late teens probably. I actually think that I might like these better now than I even did then. I was definitely very caught up in the story then, but man, these are good. Like, I feel like I just kind of assumed that they wouldn't be good because so many YA series that I really liked, looking back on now, I think were not that good or had kind of problematic messages. These are like the opposite. I appreciate the message of these, I think, so much more now than I did when I was a teenager. That's probably not surprising, but anyway, it was hard not to see parallels between, you know, a lot of the protests and things that we've seen over the past couple years. Obviously, protests have been going on forever. Kind of looking at it from the perspective of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I read earlier this year, the way that some of the districts are, you know, favored and kind of pitted against other districts, and they think that they are on the capital's side, but then when it ultimately comes down to it, they are still forced to be in the Hunger Games. They are still servants of the capital. Loved these. If you have watched the movies and not read the books, I would highly recommend the books, just because the love triangle aspect gets played up so much in the movies, and it is present in the books, but it is a very minor part of the books, and you'd never know that from watching the movie. So next I read The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavalle. I picked this up at an independent bookstore in a vlog that I made, and I had never heard of it, didn't know anything about it. It was small and cute and it looked really interesting, so I grabbed it. So this is actually a retelling of a Lovecraft story, I believe, which I have not read, so I should do that. The dedication is for H.P. Lovecraft with all my conflicted feelings, which I feel like we all understand that struggle with authors that we have loved and maybe feel like we shouldn't love, but still do. This is a story of a relatively small-time con artist person who gets drawn into a scheme of some people who are dabbling in dark and mysterious things. That's probably all I can say without spoilers, because obviously this is very small. But a lot happens, and it was really interesting. It definitely touches on some very important and tragic and timely topics. Yeah, if you are into sci-fi or fantasy or even old New York, I would read something else that he wrote for sure. A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid is a very tiny collection of kind of essays or musings upon colonization, imperialism, tourism, and corruption in Kincaid's home country of Antigua. This was wonderful, simultaneously beautiful and lyrical, but also, you know, cutting and very damning of, you know, colonial countries and tourists, all of us who take for granted that if we take a getaway somewhere, that is a blameless activity. It's so important to read things like this that remind us that, particularly if you are going to a small place, there are massive impacts of you being there beyond the impacts that you can see. Just a tiny little book, read it in one sitting, but highly recommend. And this was actually the first thing from Jamaica Kincaid that I have read, so another author to add to my list to read all of her works. That list is getting really dangerously long. At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. I have seen many people recommend this. Most recently, I believe Bookish, Brian from Bookish. This is an incredible book, very powerful, beautifully written. This is translated from French. This is the story of a Senegalese soldier in World War I who is made to fight for France, and he and his best friend from childhood joined the military, and then he goes through something really traumatic that kind of definitely causes him significant mental anguish. It really brings to the forefront the brutality of war, the types of brutality that we accept versus the ones that we consider barbaric or outside of the bounds of social acceptable behavior in a situation where you would think that there are no bounds anymore. A lot of discussion of racism. I would recommend this to anyone who's not concerned about the content matter for, you know, trigger warnings or anything. The only thing that I didn't like about this book is that he has one recurring metaphor and then also uses other metaphors that liken the battlefield to female human anatomy. It gave me weird feelings. I didn't like it. I don't know whether that was just me, but, you know, that was the only qualm I had about this book. Otherwise, I do think that it's an incredibly powerful, emotional, important work. Next, I finished The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the prequel to The Hunger Games. As soon as I read The Hunger Games, I started listening to this one. I wasn't interested at all when it came out, actually, and it got such mixed reviews that I felt very justified in not being interested, but I really liked this. It was overly long, in my opinion. I think that she could have maybe pared it down a little bit, but I enjoyed listening to it so much that I really didn't mind. Like, I was just enjoying hearing the story. So if you're not familiar, this is kind of the origin story of President Snow, who is kind of the face of the Capitol in the Hunger Games trilogy. He is one of the original pioneers and innovators of the Hunger Games. And so in this book, you're following him as a teenager as he kind of first gets involved in the Hunger Games. And it was so interesting and so good. It is my own personal pet peeve when books, I feel like YA books are often particularly guilty of this, but lots of books do this, where they make villains uncomplicated. They just make them villains. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. And I think that that's one of the worst fallacies that we have convinced ourselves of, that if you were a villain, you would know it, when in reality, I think most villains think that they're doing the right thing. And so I think it's so important to examine that and to recognize that. I did think that the switch from when you sympathize with him to when you realize that the direction that he's gonna go, well, obviously you realize it, but you know what I mean. I thought that that was kind of sudden. You know, she had a long book to do that. I felt like she did it very rapidly, but anyway, I still thoroughly enjoyed it. I listened to Black Klansman by Ron Stallworth. I got this originally from the library because I bought this book for my dad for Christmas and I wanted to make sure that it was a decent book before I gave it to him. There was a movie made of this. This is the story of a Black police officer in Colorado Springs, Colorado, who investigates the Klan and kind of inadvertently joins the Klan with his real name and has to send another police officer to be undercover in person, but he actually handles all of the conversations with the clan on the phone himself. So I thought that this was a really, engaging storyline, and it was a good story. The writing of this memoir kind of leaves something to be desired. I didn't think it was awful, but it is way too detail oriented. It's a very short book. I think the audiobook was only 6 hours total. So it's not that it's overly long. It's not. It's all just very play by play in a way that it didn't need to be. And he does spend some amount of time in kind of selling himself initially as a middle of the road person. He definitely is invested in you, not thinking he's an extremist on the Black power side. He wants you to know that he's a middle of the road guy. He just knows the clan is way too extreme, obviously. And he does speak out against, racism in all forms. He talks about how he knows that the Black Power movement also did help him in some ways. So it was kind of disappointing to read some of those sections, but it was also completely understandable, and obviously it's his book, it's his experience, he can say whatever he wants. And he did have an afterword talking about current events that I thought wrapped it up really nicely and kind of drove home modern applications, and I really appreciated that. So this wasn't an amazing book, but I still am glad that I listened to it. It was a positive experience, I guess. The last book that I finished in December was Los Juegos del Hambre, which is just the Hunger Games in Spanish, so nothing really new to report here. I did finish the first Hunger Games in Spanish. Yep, so my total for the year reading was 99 books. I was really going to make an attempt to finish a book on the last day just so that I could read 100 books. And I had a book that I really realistically could have finished that day, but I just wasn't feeling it, and I didn't want to push it to finish a book just to hit 100 books because it really does not matter. So anyway, let me know what you've been reading. If you've read any of these, what did you think? If you've reread Hunger Games as an adult, let me know what you think. And I will see you in the next video.